So good afternoon, everybody. Very excited for another episode of the Industrial Real Estate Show, and I'm honored to be joined by Doug Kiersey from Dermody Properties. And Doug has a long history in industrial real estate. Did you start as a broker at Cushman & Wakefield? Was that your first job in industrial?
That was straight out of undergrad at Oregon State University in 1983.
Then you went to spend 17 years at Prologis, and now the past 11 years at Dermody. Get the timelines right there?
Coming on 13, actually, in June.
13.
Yeah.
So that's a pretty storied history, from brokerage to working a largest institutional owner to now at Dermody. And Dermody's definitely not a small company either. I read you've been involved in $8 billion worth of developments and acquisitions.
We have, and we've had a really strong pattern of growth, especially over the last 10 years as we transition from a kind of a traditional developer model into more of a fully integrated investment manager model, which we could talk about at some length if you'd like. But yeah, it's been a great run of the company.
Yeah, well, I think we can jump into all that. There's a lot of different things that we could talk about. But first, just thanks for joining me. I really do appreciate you jumping on this call with me.
It's my pleasure. It's great to be here, and I look forward to talking all things industrial real estate.
Well, let's start there with your history going back, getting into brokerage out of college, and then to working institutional, now working at Dermody as the president. What have you seen change over that period of time from industrial real estate, which as early as even 10 years ago was not a very common topic, and very few people actually knew what industrial real estate was. So what's changed from when you got into industrial real estate, industrial real estate generally, to where it is today?
Well, it's hard to know where to start. It's changed so much. I walked into the offices of Cushman & Wakefield, and another young man came in, and the manager, judging the other guy to have more talent than me, pointed him towards the suburban office market and pointed me towards the dusty streets of East Portland to start making cold calls. So I sort of stumbled into the industrial business, if you will, but I've been very, very fortunate to be involved with it. Back in those days, we had 24-foot tall buildings with incandescent or fluorescent lighting. There was none of the automation we have in material handling equipment. So the buildings have gotten taller, they've gotten bigger, they've gotten much more automated. And the business itself of the ownership of industrial real estate, while it still is quite fragmented in the U.S., was extraordinarily fragmented back in those days prior to the securitization of real estate, which really started in the late 80s and it gained momentum in the early 90s. So prior to that, there was no Prologis, there was no Duke, there were none of the public REITs that were involved. The large players were the privates like Trammell Crow Company, and at that they still had a very, very small market share. So everything's changed from the ownership structure, much more institutionalization now than there was. Industrial real estate's come a long ways in the eyes of institutional investors, from sort of one of the sleepy asset classes to an asset class that everyone's underweight and wants to grow in. And so that's been another one of the changes. It's been a great ride. And obviously, e-commerce and the secular tailwinds have taken our business and put a turbo boost in it over the last 10 years. And
Dermody's mostly focused on that logistics warehouse side.
That's all we do. We like to say we do one thing. We think we do it well, and we don't chase any sort of shiny objects. Although from time to time it's tempting to do other things, but we're all about logistics, 100%.
One question that someone wanted me to ask you was, in terms of your portfolio, would you consider a 20 or 30-year-old building, which has some of those things that you mentioned, like perhaps lower ceiling heights, 24 feet, where you could get it at a discount to replacement value or having to build at a premium? Would you consider those older buildings that might have some functional obsolescence, or do you steer more towards the new modern buildings?
The short answer is we much prefer the modern. We have invested in some of the buildings of the type that you described. Now, an attractive logistics building in the Meadowlands in New Jersey, right across from Manhattan, might be very well be a 24-foot clear building. You certainly wouldn't invest in a building like that in Joliet, Illinois, in the I-80 corridor. But we're almost always focused on new or close to new assets, Class A in nature. But we have from time to time invested in very strategic locations. I can think of Seattle and the North Kent Valley as another example. We bought a B asset there. We invested in a lot of improvements, but at the end of the day, it's still a B plus asset. But that's sort of an exception for us. The weighted average age of our assets is only about 5 years.
Well, yeah, that's very modern then, yeah, because even some of the buildings built in 2010, as an example, although that's 14 years old now, that's above your average. So that's pretty interesting.
And it reflects that most of our investments over the last 5 years have been on the development side, and that's where the risk-adjusted returns have been more attractive as a manufacturer of the product than as an acquirer of the product. Now, the cycle that we're in presently has us back to more of a kind of 50-50 split between acquisition and development. But over the course of the last cycle, which ended about a year and a half ago, we were much heavier on development, sort of 80-20.
The development world seems pretty fragmented right now, where there's been a lot of development that's come into place. Some markets have added, Phoenix, where you're at right now, I believe that's the busiest market right now for new developments underway. So there is a lot of development underway, but higher interest rates have also caused some developers to pull back on developments. So it seems to me that there's a little bit of a gap right now where there's been so much added that some of the markets are experiencing pressure on vacancy rates, higher vacancy rates than normal, but there's less development actually being added. So do we come into this market right now, from your perspective, do we have too much inventory right now, but with less inventory being added, could this be a problem in the other way in a couple of years?
So nationally, just to give you some perspective, and I was at a CBRE conference just the other day, I think they're tracking national occupancy still around 94.5%, 95%, which is a very healthy market nationally. So generally, you can think of any market, national or individual market, or even a sub-market, at about 95% occupancy. That's still a market where landlords have a lot of pricing power. So that's still a market that's going to attract new investment in the form of new construction. What we had during COVID is we had almost zero interest rates, right? Effectively zero, very cheap borrowing costs. A lot was constructed. And if you consider that the lead time from conception to a building being ready for occupancy is 18 to 24 months. So we have not a lot, but we have some supply overhang from what was built during the COVID years that is just now being completed. So that's the supply side today. There's a little bit of upward pressure on vacancies in a number of markets, and mostly markets where there's no land constraint or very little land constraint. It's much easier to build in the West Valley of Phoenix or the I-80 corridor or markets like Columbus and Indianapolis than it is to build in northern New Jersey or Orange County. So where it was easier to build is where you'll find a little bit more supply relative to the demand. Having said that, there's a supply cliff that's developing in the U.S. right now. And I think this gets to your point, Chad. It looks like in 25 and 26, that supply is going to fall by 60 to 70% in terms of deliveries from what was delivered in the prior couple of years. And if you assume that demand remains fairly constant at this new normal level, which is to say below COVID, but still a fairly healthy demand pattern, you're going to see occupancies rise again into the very high 90s in 25 and 26. Some of our customers, I think, are already leaning into the market in anticipation of having a supply challenged market later in the next couple of years because they don't want to be caught short. So, it's really interesting. There's a race right now. Now's a great time to be a tenant, but that window is going to close over the next, I think, 6 to 12 months. It's going to stay closed for a couple of years.
Great point. What are you hearing from your tenants in terms of how they feel about the current economy right now? They're facing higher interest rates. They're probably facing pressure with inflationary things, labor costs, input costs, and then rising rates, which have been going steady for the last number of years now. Are you hearing concern from tenants about that, or are they still doing well, just the nature of the industry?
Well, it varies by tenant, by industry. Generally, I would say that decision cycles have lengthened significantly. We were working with a well-known beverage company, had a handshake on a build-to-suit in Chicago, about a year ago now. They told us that it was going to go to the board in the fall, then it was going to go to the board for approval in December. Here we are now in May, and that deal has never moved forward. So I think that the C-suite and the investment committees and the boards of our major customers, I'm talking about the larger firms, are very cautious. And that caution is lengthening decision times, which in turn, where we have that overhang of supply I was talking about, causes a little more vacancy to occur in our markets, which I believe is temporary. On the other hand, the firms, the retailers and the e-commerce companies really use their supply chain as a weapon to gain market share. So they can't afford to be too complacent in a competitive environment. And I'll just give you a quick example. You go online to buy a KitchenAid mixer, which you can buy from Target, Walmart, Amazon, and probably 20 other groups. And the KitchenAid mixer is available, so the product is widely available. It's about the same price, but one of those is going to have it to you later that day or the next morning, and the other one's going to take 3 days to deliver it to your house. Which one are you going to click on?
The earlier one every time.
Every time. And so that means that supply chain and the warehouse network that supports it has to support those delivery times. And these are very sophisticated people with very sophisticated algorithms. They know where their SKUs are moving and what locations they're moving, and they can pinpoint, they overlay transportation, they overlay customer demographics, customer demand patterns, and probably 20 other things that I don't understand. And they say, we need a 250,000 foot warehouse in Glenview, Illinois. Well, it's my job to be there with that building when they need it, or to be there with that piece of land so they can construct it to their specifications. I don't know that group of customers is necessarily as contingent on today's economics as maybe the consumer, more of the consumer brand type of customers. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. It leads neatly to the next question that I had, and that's when you're building a building, and perhaps it's spec, perhaps it's for a tenant that wants to have a building, and it's more of a build to suit. Do you feel comfortable building on spec right now, knowing that every tenant's going to have slightly different requirements on the building? Or do you still feel that industrial is ubiquitous or general enough that it can still cater to people if you build the right building?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Let me answer it by taking a half a step back and explaining the lens through which we look at all of our investments. On the demand side, you have to be in markets and submarkets where there are sustainable demand drivers. Obviously, the ports are well known as being demand drivers, but take a market like Louisville, Kentucky, where you have the UPS World Port Hub, where all the packages throughout the country come into Louisville at night, and then they're shipped out in the morning. You have 2 Ford manufacturing plants. You have the ability to reach 40% of the U.S. population in a 500-mile radius of Louisville. You have a market that is the westernmost market in the Eastern time zone, which gives shippers an extra hour to get their products to the Worldport dock every night. So those are sustainable demand drivers. You also have to be in markets where there's land constraint. If there's a lot of land you're going to be a commodity. And we know what Warren Buffett said about the tide. The tide goes out. And being a commodity is a bad place to be in our business because you're not going to have any landlord pricing power. So you have to have these sustainable demand drivers. You have to avoid being a commodity, and that generally means being in land constrained markets. So our strategy has been to kind of burrow into the markets, look at a lot of redevelopment, a lot of demolition, rather than investing in the next freeway interchange out in a cornfield. Now, a lot of people do that and they're making money at it, and it's great, but that's just, we look at things a little bit differently. So that's kind of the underlying investment thesis. And then every opportunity we see, we try to put it through that sort of sieve.
And so if when you're actually looking in property level, so I do want to explore more of the markets that you like and see if there's one specifically that you like. We'll get to that in a second because you mentioned Louisville, you mentioned Reno is another good one earlier. We'll get to that in a second, but the building itself that you're looking to put up then, and let's just assume that you do put it on spec. So you don't have somebody that's lined up that's putting input into the design of it, but you're just going to build something on spec. Is there a set group of parameters or elements that the building just absolutely needs to have to make it as marketable as possible to future tenants?
Yes. And again, that's location specific. So let's take Seattle, for instance. Seattle's a market where it's sort of a mid-sized building market. You don't see a lot of million footers in Seattle. You can build smaller, but we're not in the business of serving 5,000 and 10,000 foot customers. So if you build a 250 or 300,000 foot building in Seattle, you're very cognizant of the depth of the building. You don't want it to be more than 300 feet deep. You want it to be designed like a loaf of bread where you can slice it into 2 or 3 customers if that's what the market gives you. And then we look a lot at the demand patterns. And so if we were to think about demand as a bell curve, where is the fat part of the demand in that bell curve? Is it between 80 and 120,000 feet, or is it more closer to 250 to 350? So we want to build into the fat part of the demand curve. And of course, then the buildings have to have the appropriate dimensions, truck courts, dock doors as a percentage of rentable square footage. All those ratios have to be reflective of market. And frankly, much of that is just the institutional knowledge that the collective 80 people in our company have about what's right for that specific target market and target customer. And if you get it wrong, that could be a long slog. And a very smart person who was a mentor for me at Prologis said, if you overwork a site, it's a 40-year mistake. And so we will give up a few basis points of return to avoid overbuilding a site, to avoid pinching our truck court, to avoid some of those mistakes that one makes when you're trying to make a pro forma work.
I think there's 2 things that really stood out, sayings that you said there that I'm going to embrace and use forward is treating it like a slice of bread, because that is so key. It's if you build a 300,000 square foot building, but the market is for 70,000 square foot tenants, you need to have a way to be able to break that up. So I love that one. And then also a big mistake is a 40-year problem, because I've dealt with buildings like that as well, where the truck court or something, lower ceiling heights, it becomes a problem that is so hard to solve. So those are both great sayings.
Well, thank you. I borrowed heavily from my predecessors.
Well, I'm the same way. I like hearing smart things, and then I take them on as well. Right. With the building, so are you getting a local architecture firm to design those, or do you design them in-house? Because you said you have all this experience, 80 people that are all contributing to this and looking for areas to avoid making those mistakes. How do you go through the design process on a building?
So we'll have a team of architects, engineers, and other consultants that we've worked with in each market, and what we think are best-in-class third-party providers with whom we have long history of relationships. And the same goes for general contractors when it's time for that. But at the end of the day, our team looks at everything. And I try to look at every building plan before we sign off on it I want to know if it's a left shoulder back end. I want to know why there's a fire hydrant on the inside radius of where a truck is going to turn, because that's bad news, right? I want to make sure that the light stanchions are far enough away from the trailer parking spaces that a trailer won't back into the light post when it's being stored away from the building. And just a lot of things like that. So our culture is filled with people like me who look at those sorts of details. So it's both. We have an idea of what we want to build, and we ask the architects to execute on the vision. And the learning goes in both directions, right? So smart people that you hire also have best practices. Try to take from within and take from without.
One of the things that's been clear to anybody involved in industrial real estate is that ceiling heights have increasingly been pushed higher from, like you said, 24, some cases even smaller than that, to now the standard we're seeing 36, 40, even higher than that.
Right.
So I've got a couple questions on this, but what are you building to right now for ceiling heights? And I'm guessing that's probably market specific too.
Well, I think that generally we're saying to ourselves, any building over 400,000 feet really wants to be 40 foot clear. Mm-hmm. And 5 years ago, that standard was 36. Mm-hmm. Certainly any building that's 500, 700, a million feet has to be at least 40 feet. We're hearing rumblings now about customers wanting to go even higher than that. But 40 feet is a fairly new number in the marketplace, but a number that we're very comfortable with. And it's not a small task. You're now challenging the fire code. You're changing the thickness of your slab, the thickness of your walls. And having to maneuver around the fire code and having the right fire suppression system is a much different thing at 40 feet than even it is at 32. But as the buildings step down in size, 36 is still very appropriate for buildings, call it 400 to 200. Under 200, and I think depends again on the market, but you can get down to 32. If there's any kind of a jump ball, we're going to spend the extra 75 cents or $1 a square foot to go to the next increment up. Because remember that if you're thinking about owning these buildings for 10, 20, 30 years, you want to avoid functional obsolescence, not just today, but in your later leasing cycles.
The other thing that's also become a lot more apparent in very recently, probably within the last 10 years, whereas the ceiling heights have been increasing for 40 plus years now. What I've found new, and I'd love to get your thoughts on this, is more power requirements. So it comes back to racking technology and automation, electrification of everything. Yeah. This was never even contemplated 10, 20 years ago, but now all these companies are trying to get robotics and AI, the Internet of Things. Everything requires so much more power. A lot of these older buildings weren't built with that in mind. And even some buildings 10, 15 years ago weren't built with this in mind. What are you hearing from tenants on their upcoming power requirements, and how do you address that?
We talk about that all the time. And the world is changing on us in a much more rapid pace with respect to electrical power. You rattled off a lot, but you didn't mention also electrifying the fleets. And so now we are running conduit out to the remote trailer parking and truck parking spaces away from the dock, so that if a customer wants to have their fleet electrified in the future, and that technology is not widely adopted now, but we're planning for it. And so that's another aspect. I'm going to take a step back. This country is running out of electrical capacity. Smart people like the people listening to your podcast probably already know that. The general public, I don't think, has a clue. When you look at what's happening with AI, how we're trying to electrify the passenger car fleet, let's call it the involuntary and early retirement of a lot of legacy generation. So supply has got downward pressure and demand is like this. And so it never occurred to us 2 or 3 or 5 years ago that we would need to be concerned about building a 500,000 foot building and getting a 7,000 or 8,000 amp service into the building. We just called up the local power company and, when do you guys come out and hook us up? Things have become much, much more complicated. So now the availability of power and the source of its generation has become one areas of risk that we are very cognizant of. And it's no slam dunk that if you have a company that needs a little more, it's no slam dunk that you're going to get it. And I think we're on the 5-yard line of this being a problem, and we've got 95 yards to go. And I think, sorry to be so opinionated, but I think the country is in for a rude awakening here about the shortage of electrical power.
I completely agree. And we haven't even started the mass transition to electric vehicles yet. And different governments want to have it mandated by 2030, 2035. It's 12 years from now that they want to have all new vehicles be electrified. And the grid is already struggling. There's blackouts I heard in Texas because of the heat, and they've had to, the air conditioning was causing strain on the grid. So they can't even handle what we're dealing with now, let alone AI is a huge draw on power. I think that a lot of people are underestimating just what goes into AI computing and developing the language models and then data centers and trying to electrify everything. I'm with you. I don't think anybody's thinking about where this is all going to come from.
And on top of that, we're early closing some of these generation that are, coal's out of favor, obviously for good reason. Natural gas is out of favor. There doesn't seem to be any desire to build nuclear plants. Well, where's it going to come from? Well, there's not going to be enough wind and solar to run all of this. But that's a whole nother podcast that people much smarter than me would be able to speak to. But as a consumer and a provider to my customers, I'm worried that we're on the cusp of something that is going to be a problem.
Are you looking at solar as a solution to offset some of the power requirements?
We are, and we're making all of our roofs solar ready, which means beefing up the structure. It's about another, $4 or $5 a square foot to not that much, probably another $1 or so a square foot in most markets to add that capacity. So it means your columns and your joists, are thicker and bigger, and it's just a little more expensive to do that. But we believe that that's coming. But it's very idiosyncratic on a market by market basis how solar works. So I'll give you a quick case in point. A project in suburban Chicago, the utility is ComEd. You can lease your roof to a solar provider that is approved by them, and there's only one. Okay, so you lease your roof for, call it 10 cents a square foot a year. You sign a 20-year lease of your roof. The provider, third-party provider, provides all the material and labor. They install it. The power goes to the grid. It doesn't go to your building. So you have no control of the power. All you're getting is a roof lease. And for that, the provider wants to have a bunch of easements and then get on your roof. And there's all kinds of challenges there operationally. But it's not a solution from the standpoint of power security, because the power goes back to ComEd. In the case of the community solar in Illinois, they then sell that incremental power to low-income customers at a discount. And so that's kind of the pattern of how it works. As a neophyte, I thought, gee, let's put solar in all our buildings and we'll have power to our buildings. Doesn't work that way. And then, of course, the solarity in Chicago is a lot different than it is in Phoenix. So there's just a lot of local. Again, from where I sit as a provider of brick and mortar, it's still fairly new. Now, big guys like Prologis have I think really done a good job of leaning into this, but in terms of its adoption across the archipelago of industrial real estate in the U.S., it's still very, very early.
So with there being more requirements for power coming up, do you see developers starting to jostle for position to try and secure a site, bring the power in perhaps even before they're building, but just make sure that they've got it to come in? And then does this create a scenario where there's haves and have-nots, where one building owner that, like Prologis or you guys, where you go and have the foresight to do this, someone comes along after and the pie has already been chopped up? Is this a concern going forward?
Yes. And I don't quite know how to navigate it because typically with a local utility, and that's a fragmented business, right? So it's not as if you have these national relationships. So I'm sitting in Phoenix and we're an Arizona Power customer, but I could be a ComEd customer in Chicago and et cetera. They don't want to guarantee or reserve capacity for you until you can show demand. So right away, everyone listening to this can say, wait a minute, that's a classic chicken and an egg. I can't get demand until I can guarantee power, and I can't guarantee power until I get demand. And so it's setting up sort of a process that you describe where we're going to have to do everything in our power, no pun intended, to understand this risk. And again, this sounds a little third world, but that's kind of where we are.
I think everybody tuned in would agree that it is a concern because demand is going steep curve up and supply is fixed. It's very difficult to add new supply right now. So yeah, this will be a concern. The other side of that coin that I see, and you're not involved in this space, but still would love to get your thoughts, is in that older Class B industrial where you take a warehouse that's 30 years old. It probably already has some limitations, literally with the ceiling height, might not have the long truck courts. There might be some other things, but now you add in, it certainly wasn't designed with heavy power in mind. Because back in the day, when 30-year-old warehouse, it was just racking. You had a diesel-powered forklift. You had enough power to operate your lighting, maybe a little bit of other stuff, but very limited power. What does that Class B building look like compared to what the requirement is going to be now and going forward?
It looks like one of two things. It either is still marginally functional for a subset of customers who are very rate sensitive and perhaps very location sensitive, because these buildings tend to exist in the infill part of the market. So, you see those everywhere you go in every city in the US, and they're still operating on some level. They're just not attracting the Amazons and the Walmarts and the Pepsis, right? They're attracting, local customers with a lower credit profile who are rate sensitive. That's one bucket. And the second bucket is it's ready to be torn down. And so we're in the business of finding assets that have outlived their useful life, where the land value now exceeds the value of the total asset. And we're finding these all over the country, not just old warehouse and old manufacturing buildings, but office parks and coal-fired power plants and milk processing plants and all kinds of uses whose useful life has expired. Those have the quality of tending to be very near or in urban centers, which is where we want to be, because that's where our customers want to be, because that's where their customers' rooftops are. So it gets back to my earlier comment about trying to be in land-constrained submarkets. And there's nothing more land-constrained than tearing down the global headquarters of Allstate in close-in suburban Chicago.
Yeah, who would have thought that even 5 years ago, pre-COVID, that office buildings now would be worth less than the land to be rebuilt as a distribution center? It's just 5 years, and that much has changed.
It's incredible to think about it. The only thing holding it back actually is NIMBYism. And so, no one loves our trucks. Very few people like the architectural look and feel of our campuses, although I happen to think a well-designed industrial building with mature landscaping is fine and should be a welcome addition. But I've sat in a lot of meetings, a lot of public hearings in a lot of villages, townships, towns, and cities. And I can tell you that there is a huge pushback in the United States against logistics facilities, which, again, puts downward pressure on supply. It puts upward pressure on the value of those assets which are able to be built. So our job is to navigate through those waters and be one of the few people that can supply something that's quite rare.
Yeah, on that topic, I know Inland Empire's facing a lot of opposition. There's either moratoriums or proposed bans for new warehouses. There's even just outside of Chicago, I think it's Deerfield, where they put a warehouse
Yeah.
ban on any new things.
Yep.
Do you see that proliferating and becoming more widespread, or is there still enough of an appetite for development and the corresponding jobs and property tax revenue that come in that there's still enough of a runway, or do you see that attitude growing more across the board?
Generally, as communities that are in the outer suburbs or the exurbs, generally when they're in the early part of their development as a community, they do put a lot of value in the taxes that we can generate, the fact that we don't put pressure on local schools like residential does, and some of the other benefits that we bring to the table. As you move closer to the urban core and you're into very mature, close-in suburbs, that case is much harder to make, and the bar is a lot higher. You mentioned Deerfield, that's kind of near my hometown, and I followed that very closely, and that's emblematic of what's happening around the country in mature suburbs, and it's getting worse. It's getting the bar is getting a lot higher now, and on top of that, some states like California have layered on state laws related to air quality, related to the concept of justice, where some of the lower income communities are taking the brunt of the logistics development, and in their view, that's not fair. And so there's a lot going on at the state, county, and local level that is putting downward pressure on new deliveries.
Yeah, so you start looking out to 25, 26, and you've got that pipeline is slowing down right now, and then it's further being hindered by opposition to new developments. We could be in a scenario where they're the same with power. It's just a demand supply imbalance, and we all know what happens there. It's kind of a worrisome thought from outside of the landlord, investor, developer standpoint, but from a tenant standpoint, that we could be entering a period again where there's just very limited inventory for them to even lease.
I think tenants have a tiny bit of pricing power now, the most pricing power they've had in the last 5 years. I said before, that's probably a very short window, and all the factors that you just summarized reflect, I think, a lower supply environment in the out years. And let's remember that e-commerce is still growing at a double-digit CAGR, and I don't think consumer patterns are going to change. If anything, I mean, my doorbell rings 3 times a day with something, and I'm not even really in the demographic, right? I mean, my grown children pretty much have everything brought to their home, from bananas to child car seats.
And I'm in that as well. My wife will still go to stores from time to time, but I look at it. Why would I want to drive to a store, navigate a parking lot, the stress that comes with that, go in and have to find everything, walk through all the aisles, stand in line, and then do it all in reverse to get home, when I can click a button and it just shows up at my door? Like, it's the convenience. I agree with you. I think that's the reason why it has grown at such pace that it has, and why I think there's still a long runway on that.
And our demand for our space follows that. And if I could remember that the return rate when you go to Nordstrom is in the high single digits, but if you order online from Nordstrom, that return rate goes up 2 to 3x. So you have this entire reverse logistics part of the business that's growing right along with e-commerce. That's more demand for our space. That's a different kind of demand, but it's still demand.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's the reverse logistics. I think is heavily underrated because most people just focus on a distribution center. Everything comes in, gets sent out accordingly, but it also goes in reverse when things get returned. So I think that is.
And when it comes back, it's not in its original packaging, right? Mm-hmm. It has to be sorted by hand. It has to be put into this bin we can resell. This bin we can resell to a wholesaler, and this bin goes to the landfill. And it's a heavy labor intensive process. You might have even had a situation where you got something wrong from Amazon. You contacted them and they say, just keep it. Does this cost more for them to process it if you send it back than it's worth?
Yeah, I had that happen with a toaster that I bought last year. The exact same thing. There's something wrong with it, and they just sent me a new one and told me to keep it for that exact reason. It's just the box, the size. By the time you figure out how to, and then there's something wrong with it too. So, yeah, I think that is pretty common.
I tell my kids, if you want to be a billionaire, figure out how to eliminate all this virgin cardboard that's being used in our country one time, right? How can we find containers, and maybe it's like the old bottle bill where there's a deposit on them or something, but the container goes back and gets reused multiple times. And I don't know if you're like at my home, but every week we put out, a stack of brand new cardboard. I guess allegedly it gets recycled, but it still seems like it's wasteful.
Yeah, I agree with that. We had a couple questions come in that I want to get to, and we've got about 20 minutes left. So if anyone else has questions for Doug, please put it in the chat. Andy commented, what's interesting about the Allstate project is that the one down the street got canceled. Do you know about that?
I know all about it. I'm not going to use the name of the other developer. They're a very strong, privately held firm. They build great product. So on the Allstate specifically, it was a pure unicorn project. And this is granular, but it sits between a 10-lane tollway on one side, a forest preserve on the other side, and a very mature existing commercial center to the third side, and then a tiny little piece of residential on the south end. It abuts two municipalities. We were in unincorporated Cook County. We were able to go to the municipality that wanted us, and because we had a choice, we had a little bit of negotiating leverage, but mostly because it's almost an island, and the municipality that we ended up with, Glenview, and with whom we have a great relationship, 99% of its residents live on the other side of the tollway. And so our project is completely immaterial to their daily lives. We're also right at a four-way interchange, which had been sized for 13,000 daily Allstate employees. And our traffic will be something like a third of that. So all these things kind of came together to make that project viable from an entitlement perspective. The Deerfield site had none of those advantages. And on top of that, it was developed as a campus for Baxter. The buildings apparently had some architectural significance. It didn't have the kind of ingress and egress that we had. They had to transition through some residential or commercial districts to get to the tollway. So they just had all these things kind of stacked against them. But I think what was also stacked against them is that the neighborhoods had a learning curve. So we were effectively able to blunt local criticism because of the facts of our deal. But everyone's getting more and more sophisticated in how they attack these projects. And so the Deerfield people watched what happened in Glenview, and they were ready for this other company when the time came. And lastly, I natter on. I think tactically they proposed too large of a building. They wanted to build I forget if it was 800,000 square feet or 1 million feet. Our buildings are 300,000 feet. That's a much different visual than a 1 million foot building.
Yeah, most people have never seen a 1 million square foot building. Well, until recently. I mean, a lot of Amazon buildings now are in that size, so and those are more prominent. But 10 years ago, 1 million square feet, most people would never even imagine what one of those look like.
And you said to Amazon, the A word is anathema to many of these local communities. Yet they want to have their packages there, but they don't want to see any Amazon trucks coming and going. So we live in an age of cognitive dissonance, but that's one of the things we hear.
Yeah, they want the milk, they just don't want to see the cow.
That's right.
Wyatt has a question as well. Is there anywhere in the U.S. that doesn't have the power constraints you mentioned? And is the cost of energy, not the amount, a factor in where to build?
Yeah. And we got pretty deep into the energy thing, and I don't want to put myself forward as an expert, although I'm getting up the learning curve. In the Pacific Northwest, which I'm familiar with, almost all the electricity there is hydropower in the Columbia River system. It's like 7 dams on the Columbia River, and the Bonneville Power Administration has unlimited cheaper power. So we're seeing a lot of these data centers go up there. But I really can't give chapter and verse on which areas of the country are more or less expensive. I apologize for that, but that pretty much exhausts my knowledge of rate differentials.
On that topic, though, what markets are you most interested in right now? And you mentioned land constraint is a big operative on that. Are there still even more specific markets that you're focused in on?
So our focus generally has been the coastal markets of the West Coast, Chicago, Louisville, and Northern Kentucky, which is really part of Cincinnati, and then the East Coast. We've been active in Savannah. There's a very dynamic port story around how many TEUs are in Savannah and how it's growing relative to the other East Coast ports. But we're up and down the East Coast into New Jersey. We're also active in Delaware. 5 years ago, Delaware would never have come out of my mouth. But now you have in the eastern part of the country, basically one continuous market in the I-95 corridor from the port markets of New Jersey all the way down to the Baltimore-Washington corridor. So, that's where most of the people in the country live, and that's attractive to us. But, West Coast, East Coast, and a couple of markets in the middle. That's kind of what we do.
And what are you looking for specifically? And perhaps there's somebody listening in on this that might have an opportunity. What ticks the boxes for you?
I'd love to see 10 to 100 acres of developable land near the urban cores. I've explained I don't really like the exurbs because they're not land constrained. So anywhere where it's hard to do something, where something is complicated, we're experts in that. And a lot of times it'll take a year or two to get through entitlements, to get through environmental, to get through some of the other hurdles. We have a team embedded in the organization to work on all those variables. But at the end of the day, we want to do something where we're building and where customers want to be, and they might have our choice, and that's it. And that's how you generate pricing power.
Yeah, great point. I had a few early questions come in from the same guy, and I'm going to ask these as well because I thought they were fantastic questions. His first one, he said, can you think of anything that most of the industry says matters that in practice hasn't mattered very little or not at all?
Well, that's interesting. There's a bit of a construct where we believe that our building is different than our competitors' buildings. Our slabs are better. We've got more glass, this and that. Truth of it is the real differentiation's in the location. And so once you meet a minimum standard of quality and a minimum standard of design, I think there's a little bit of an idea that you can differentiate yourself that way with your customers, but I think it's a bit of a fallacy. The real estate manager of, I used to say Sears. That's how old I am. Real estate manager of Sears lands in Portland. He goes out the airport onto Airport Way, and he's got 5 buildings to look at. And by the time he or she gets back in their car and goes back to the airport, they can't remember anything about how the 5 buildings looked that was different than the other. And so they're going to compete on rent, right? Well, I want to make sure when that real estate director gets out of their car and drives to the submarket, they only have one building to look at, and that's mine.
Yeah, I think that's profound, and that's the big, kind of leads to the biggest real estate cliche of all, the location, location, location.
Right.
That's great, but there's also that added benefit of, if you can convince someone that you have a better mousetrap, they're likely to
Sometimes you can
go to
do
yours.
that, but I think there's a conceit in our business that your building is going to be, meaningfully different than the next building. Sometimes that's the case, but not as often as you would think.
Yeah, that's a great answer. He also asked, he asked what you were paying attention to now that you weren't 10 or 20 years ago. I think we touched on that. Like, power is obviously the big one. Anything else that's really big that you're really focused on right now?
Well, functionality. We talked a lot about functionality, the avoidance of taking obsolescence risk, and I think as well that we try to stick to this mantra: great buildings attract great customers when they're in great locations. And if you don't meet that standard, then you're not going to get the kind of value that you want for your investors. So let's think about it in the reverse. Everyone knows in their business about a building that's not that well maintained. Maybe there's some functional obsolescence. The landlord is absentee. You see hygiene issues. What kind of a tenant is that going to attract? It's going to attract a crappy tenant, right? And what is their credit profile likely to look like? Not great. So, as you know, in a down cycle, that kind of credit risk is something that we really try to avoid. And so investing, and look, there's all kinds of smart people that do nothing but invest in B buildings and B locations because they chase yield. I think the chasing of yield is something over my 40 years that I've gotten away from. And I borrow from Charlie Munger, and I'll probably butcher the quote, but he said he'd rather buy great assets at fair prices than he would buy fair assets at great prices. And I strongly believe in that mantra. Now, again, the caveat is a lot of smart people have done well dealing in lesser quality properties, but it's when things are tough, these assets will not lease. Because remember, there's certain parts of the cycle during the great financial crisis. I owned all kinds of B assets when I was at Prologis. For those familiar with Chicago and the O'Hare submarket, and that band of assets that were built back in the 50s and 60s in Oak Grove Village, the taxes were like $2 a square foot. Today they're probably $6 a foot. But we were doing gross leases at $250 a foot. Like, Doug, why would you lease this for 50 cents net? Well, someone's paying the taxes. And by the way, it costs $1 a foot to heat the building. And if I don't have a tenant paying me my 50-cent net rent, I'm out $3 of cash. And that's just a terrible place to be. So, that's my little speech about why you want to have great assets.
Well, I love that saying as well. A great building and a great location leads to great tenants. And I think that is very true. When you deviate off the location or off the asset, the building itself, you're going to get a lesser tenant. So I think that is a very good thing to bring up on that.
And then you have to ask yourself as an investor, are you getting paid to take that risk? So if my yields, let's say my yields are a 7, which is actually kind of where we're operating today, and my NOI divided by cost is a 7 yield. What kind of a premium return do I need to drive to get that appropriate risk embedded in my returns for the assets that we just talked about? Is it an extra 50 basis points of return, or is it 200 basis points of return? I would suggest that a lot of people misprice that risk.
I've had that conversation a lot recently as well, that a lot of risk is not being fully accounted for. And the best example I have of that is anybody that bought an office building in 2019. nobody was pricing in the risk that we have a once in a century pandemic where it shifts the nature of how people want to go to work. That wasn't priced in. At no point was that priced into it. And I don't think there's anything as catastrophic that can hit the industrial market, but there's still risk. There's risks that we don't know. There's systemic, non-systemic risk. There's all this risk that I do not think is being priced in. So yeah, it might even be higher than 200 basis points if you really want to be honest about the risk that you're pricing in.
One of the things we know about real estate in terms of customer demand, tenant demand, it's very inelastic with respect to price. You can lower in some parts of the cycle and some assets, like you mentioned, rent could be zero, and you're not going to attract a tenant. Now, if you're Nike and you have an extra 500,000 pairs of a certain style or color of shoe that didn't sell at full retail, you can keep marking those down until someone's going to buy a pair of $10 Nikes. You can't do that in real estate because ours is only about 5 to 10% of the total cost of goods sold so the other 90%, they still have to spend money to get there. So there are points in the cycle where you literally can't give space away. You just want to be you want to have a strategy where you're as protected from that as you could possibly be.
Yeah, I certainly appreciate that. And it makes me think, like, do a hard reflection on properties that I've invested in as well on that. But we'll have to do a part 2 on this because I could talk to you about industrial real estate and ask you questions all day.
And I want to make sure I tell everybody it's not right or wrong. It's just different. So, risk adjusted returns need to be taken into account.
Yeah, I completely agree. The last question I have for you, and then we'll wrap up. Unless anyone else has any questions, I didn't see any. If you did have one more question for Doug, feel free to put it in the chat. But this was a question that came up, which I just think is an excellent question. I don't know if it has an excellent answer or not because it kind of puts you on the spot. But I'm going to try to ask this more in podcasts. And the question he said was, "What questions should I be asking that I haven't?"
That covers a lot of ground. But we didn't really touch on the capital markets today and what the Fed has done to the value of assets of all sorts, including mine. That's probably another hour to talk about that. So we talked a lot about customer demand, but we didn't talk a lot about investor demand. And so we've gone from almost a zero Fed funds rate to 5.5%, which has had an enormous downward pressure on valuations. And I think the distress in real estate generally is maybe in the first 3 innings, and this distress across asset types has a long way to go, especially as today's jobs report came out. It was kind of a Goldilocks report, and the bond market liked it, but we're still at the 10-year at around 4.6. That means industrial cap rates are, probably closer to 6. They were 3 a little while ago. So if I have $1 of revenue, someone was willing to pay me 33 times that dollar. So they're willing to pay me $33 to get my dollar. Now they're willing to pay me $18 to get my dollar. That's half. That's what's happening in our market, and so we're all trying to navigate this new world order, and it's going to persist, and that's going to have a shakeout effect. You mentioned office. I can't imagine waking up every day and trying to figure that out. As a paraphrase Jay-Z, I got 99 problems, but that ain't one.
But office ain't one. If you're up for it, would you want to jump back on another call in a couple of weeks? I just jotted down those questions. I love to chat more about those, and I completely value your time. So I recognize how valuable your time is. But if you're up for it, I'd love to continue this.
As you can tell, this is my life's work and my passion. I'd love to chat with you and your group anytime that it's mutually convenient.
Okay, I'll send you and Nicole a email after this, and we'll tee up a time. But I love it. I love talking to people that are passionate about industrial real estate, and you clearly are. And yeah, I'm already looking forward to the second episode on this.
Great. We'll take it at the appropriate time. But you've been
Perfect.
very kind today to listen to me, and thank you so much for the preparation as well. Obviously, you're deeply involved in the industry, and it's nice to have a chat with someone who knows so much as a starting point.
Yeah, well, thank you for that. It's definitely a passion of mine as well. So we both share that in common.
Yeah.
In the meantime, so this will go on YouTube and podcast later. But if someone's just listened to this one episode, I'll put a link to Dermody Properties. Anywhere else that you'd like to highlight, LinkedIn or anything?
I'll leave that to Nicole, who handles all of those details for us. But I can't think of anything. A link to the Dermody website would be terrific.
Okay, well, I'll definitely include that in the show notes, and look forward to picking up this for a part 2 in the near future.
Thank you, Chad. It's been terrific.